Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Missing 411 Examined. This case is from Chapter 2, but I thought it was worth releasing on its own. Not just because of the sheer amount of information I was able to get directly from the Sheriff's Department, but because of how underrepresented it is in the book. You'll see what I mean when we get into it. Also, be sure to let me know what you think of this voice as a narrator in the comments below.
Gregory R. Brown, who was 49 years old at the time, went missing on July 5, 2005 from Rachel Lake Trailhead, Lake Canchas, Washington. On the 5th, Gregory was reported missing. He had borrowed a friend's car to go to Rachel Lake, which was about 1 mile away from where he had parked. This is a rugged area, with Box Canyon being between the parked car and his destination. The local sheriff's department searched first, before being joined by search and rescue teams. The search carried on for 3.5 days before being called off due to bad weather. He was reportedly in good health and not suicidal. Oh boy, this case is far more nuanced and complicated than is represented in the book. Before we cover the facts surrounding Greg's disappearance, it is first necessary to discuss another person, Robert Bob Hagel. Bob and Greg used to have a romantic relationship. This relationship was reportedly sporadic and contentious, with a therapist that Greg once saw writing in all caps on a discharge paper, "Stop seeing Bob." This stemmed from a rough breakup the two had had before. They moved into a house together and all seemed well, but then Bob started seeing another man on the side, eventually leaving Greg for this other man. This left Greg to pay for the house all on his own, which he could not afford. He complained to his sister that Bob did not treat him well, that there were some allegations of domestic abuse, though I don't believe that Bob was ever formally charged with anything. To top it off, there were also reports of drugs being used by Greg and Bob during their relationship. Bob would later say that this was Greg's way of trying to get closer to him physically. Fast forward a while, and now Bob is back in town to house sit for a friend named Dana. While Bob is in town, he and Greg make plans to spend the 4th of July together, bicycling around trails and spending some time in nature. This is where the timeline becomes contentious, in my opinion, as now we have to take Bob's word for what happens next. On the 4th, around 1 or 2 p.m., Bob drove over to Greg's house using Dana's truck. They took the bikes to some trails, and did bike around some at about 3 p.m., but ultimately ended up going for a drive instead at about 3:30 p.m. Bob drove Greg around the back roads and trails for the next 8 to 9 hours, occasionally getting out for short amounts of time and not turning around to head back home until 11 p.m. or midnight. Over the course of their journey, they discuss the possibility of getting back together, which Bob refers to as just a dream, something that wouldn't happen, but it was a happy thought. Greg made a few sexual advances on Bob, but Bob rebuffed him. When they turned around, Bob switched seats with Greg so that Greg could drive for a while. They stopped about a dozen or so times on the way back, getting out for a little bit each time. This is where the first glaring inconsistency in Bob's story arises, which is why I gave the disclaimer earlier that the timeline is contentious. The detective asks Bob if they ever got out of the car in the dark. Bob says no. The detective then asks what time it gets dark there. Bob says around 9:30 p.m. So, if we believe every word that Bob says, it was light outside when they got out of the car a dozen or so times after 11 p.m. or midnight on their way back. Editor's note: this discrepancy might be caused by there being 2 instances of so-called turning around. The first time is at about 4 p.m. around Stampede Pass. The second time is when they decide to head back home. The interview jumps around in the timeline quite a bit, presumably to make lies more difficult. An unintended consequence of this is that it makes for a very difficult read, with references being lost along the way. There are other issues with the statement that we will get to later, but I wanted to point this out for the sake of transparency. Continuing the story, around 2 a.m., Bob was concerned by Greg's driving. Greg had bad night vision, and Bob was worried that they were going to get into an accident. He asked Greg to pull over, and they did at the trailhead for Rachel Lake. Bob's intention was to get some sleep, but Greg had something on his mind that he didn't want to share with Bob. Whatever it was, it caused Greg to become agitated, and at around 2:30 a.m., he got out of the car and told Bob that he was going on a short walk around the parking lot. Bob got out of the car to relieve himself, then entered the truck on the driver's side to get more comfortable so that he could go to sleep. He was not concerned about Greg since he was staying near the truck and he had a small flashlight. At about 3 a.m., Bob falls asleep. When Bob awoke at 5:30 a.m., Greg was gone. There was only one other car in the parking lot, and Bob didn't see any trace of Greg. He got up and assumed that Greg had gone looking for someone to hook up with, such as the owner of the vehicle that was parked here. Bob hiked up the trail, about an hour down, an hour back, looking for Greg, but couldn't find him. By the time that he had returned, there were several more vehicles in the parking lot. One of them was a ranger's vehicle, and up the trail, about 100 yards or so before he became winded, and so he waited around until about 3 p.m., another 5 hours, to see if anybody would come down off the trail that he could talk to. Nobody did, so he wrote some notes and left them on the ranger's vehicle, bulletin board, and an entrance to the bathroom. Bob explains that the reason why he waited so long was because he and Greg went hiking and got lost last year in the woods when they became separated. Bob found his way out of the woods, but Greg was lost overnight before finally showing up the next day with a broken nose, apparently from a fall. Bob then expresses that he believes that Greg intended to not come back out of the woods now. He also says that maybe a cougar or a bear got him, or maybe he fell off a cliff because he wasn't very sure-footed. It is here that we learn that, according to Bob, Greg suffered from paranoia, schizophrenia, and suicidal thoughts. He recalled one time in particular that Greg allegedly thought about drowning himself in a river. It is of note that the mental health issues are backed up in a statement made by Greg for a petition for financial assistance. Bob then asserts that Greg had his pack with him that contained Greg's cell phone and keys, and makes this interesting statement shortly after. He says that, quote, "Everything makes noise, and your perception of it can be altered depending on what you're thinking," close quote. He went on to say that he thought that he had heard Greg hitting a tree with a stick and calling his name, a female voice trying to get him lost, and various other voices calling him names. Greg's family, from what I gleaned from reports and notes, seemed to think that Bob was to blame. It wasn't just due to the odd story and inconsistencies with missing time. Bob, in his statement, also floated the idea that Greg had made a sexual advance on a random stranger in the park that night, and that the stranger didn't like this and strangled Greg to death. What an odd thing to bring up, especially when in the same interview, Bob says that Greg was making advances on him, which he didn't like and rebuffed. Not only that, but there's the matter of Greg's phone. Bob said that Greg had his phone with him when he left, in his pack. Cell phone records show that calls were both received by and made from Greg's phone on the day after he went missing. Obviously, investigators were excited to see this and they took a look into it. The calls were made from Greg's phone to Dana's phone on the 6th of July, again, the day after Greg went missing, at around 1:37 a.m., 1:45 a.m., and 5:22 a.m., with a fifth call also being at 5:22 a.m. The connection times lasted between 1 and 7 minutes. Greg's house phone then made calls to Dana at 8:31 a.m. and 8:32 a.m. Bob had told police that he had never been back to Greg's house since Greg disappeared. So, what's going on? Well, from what I can tell, Bob's account doesn't exactly line up with reality. Bob apparently actually was in possession of Greg's cell phone and presumably used it to make those calls. Additionally, we know that Bob had made at least one call from inside of Greg's house after he went missing, because it was from there that Bob called Greg's family, I believe it was his brother, on July 6th at around 6 a.m. Again, this is just over 24 hours after Greg went missing. This is what Bob said according to that family member. Quote, "I loved Greg. I was as sprung on him as he was on me." Close quote. This is an alarming shift to past tense, given how recently Greg had gone missing. The search carried on for only a few days, but utilized helicopters and search dogs. Bob was interviewed twice and submitted to a polygraph exam, which came back inconclusive. Bob was also noted to have a condition which prevents him from sweating, which is an indicator on the test. I'm not totally sure on this assertion that Bob has this condition, but I honestly don't put much stock in polygraph exams anyway, so I don't think that really matters. All of this to say, the record in Missing 411 is a gross oversimplification when it comes to the statement that Greg borrowed a friend's car and went missing when he went for a hike. As for the statement of him being in good health and not suicidal, well, Greg was on disability, with difficulty breathing and facing multiple hospital bills. Oh, and will you look at that? He was suicidal, if we believe Bob, and the initial missing persons reports would show him as suicidal. Perhaps another contributing factor would be the state of Greg's finances. He had less than $200 in the bank, and $100 of that was withdrawn on the 4th. This $100 was never recovered, by the way, nor was Greg's camera and a few other belongings. I know I went really in depth onto this case where I haven't gone into others, but this one had the benefit of a very responsive sheriff's department, which furnished me with the documents that I've been showing. Also, looking into it, it just seems so unfair that this complex case with so much going on and nuance was reduced to just a short few paragraphs that really weren't all that accurate. Information that I've shown here is directly from sheriff's documents. I was also able to contact Greg's brother, who agreed to look over my information for accuracy. I haven't heard back from him since then, and not wanting to pester him for obvious reasons, I decided to go ahead and record this and post. If I do hear back and any of the information is incorrect, there will be a follow-up video on this case, which will be linked here on screen somewhere. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video all the way to the end. Until next time, take care.